Okay, we'll get started. Welcome back to the Colorado Grain Chains Homeschool. This is part 2 of growing wheat. My name is Dan Waldvogel. I'm the membership coordinator with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. And welcome. We are back and live. Just a couple housekeeping things. For folks, the best way to ask a question is to use the Q&A function. You can also use the chat function, but it's a lot easier to kind of keep the question straight using the Q&A. But if you need to communicate anything, feel free to use the chat function. As far as ways to access information and this video later, if you are a Colorado Grain Chain member, you can see recipes, notes, and presentations in the Grain Lessons Planning Google Drive folder, and that is linked on the password protected members only page on the Colorado Grain Chain website at coloradograinchain.com. But also, if you are a non-member, you can still access this video. It'll be uploaded to YouTube replay. You can just find that by searching Colorado Grain Chain on YouTube. Let me reintroduce our speakers from last week. They are grain growers, Demetria and Bryce Stevens. They operate a family farm in the Central High Plains. So they'll continue their discussion today on growing wheat, all the lessons they've learned and how they get that wheat to market. So without further ado, I'll hand it on over. Thank you for joining us today and providing your time, Demetria and Bryce.
Yeah, hello. So last week I talked a lot about basics of growing wheat from seed, planting, to harvest, to selling. But I think what I was missing, or what I could add to, is understanding some of the basic quality tests that have been standardized in the United States. You see the USDA has a grading system for wheat and other crops, and I had the organizers send out a handout, quick facts for producers on sampling grain and testing, and then a group called the Plains Grains that put up a maps from several years. Two of them I selected from 2018 and 2019 that show some different tests and differences between years. And we've done a lot of tests over the years, maybe not always every kind of test every year, but I'll talk some about those. But I think it's really important to have a basic understanding of the quality tests that are standardized in the United States. So some of the common ones that farmers talk about are test weight, protein, moisture, germination, soil, well, just sampling, the sample that you collect, how to sample it. Moisture is, well, dockage is another one that you hear a lot of at conventional markets. And that's what that first handout really describes well for corn, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat. Some of the tests you can do yourself. Those would be like a moisture test. There's handheld devices that you can buy on Amazon that are very affordable. For germination, you can do a simple test yourself to like take 400 seeds and put them between two napkins, wet the napkins and let them sit in kind of a decent warm place or room temperature place for a few days, and keep it kind of, you don't want it to dry out too much and you don't want it to be too wet. Sprout them and count the seeds and get a percentage that way. Some of the other tests like protein or test weight, there's not really a simple at-home way to do those. You would need to have especially for protein testing, a machine that's at this point I think it's very expensive and not really accessible. So if you knew any kind of facility, or if there is a lab that you can find for your area, you can send a sample to the facility to do those kinds of tests. And they're usually pretty affordable, usually under $100 to do some basic tests. On that maps, those 2 years of maps from the Plains Grains, that's a marketing group, and it's I'm not endorsing them, but they are it has some of the best examples that I've seen of collecting the information of quality tests in the Pacific Northwest, and then they have my region as the Gulf region. So the main point that I wanted to bring out from looking at those is great variation from year to year, especially with the protein. 2018 in my area was a very good year for protein, and this year, or 2019, was very poor. And you could see some variation at the farm level, where some farms got maybe 11 or 12 protein, but probably the vast majority of the people in my region saw 9, 10, some even saw 8 protein, which is very, very low for bread quality wheat. And the test weights, though, were very high this year, where last year maybe they were a little lower in my area. So getting all those kinds of numbers to align can be very difficult and sometimes out of a farmer's control. And some of them are in a farmer's control, like test weight. If you wait to harvest wheat and it rains on the wheat when it's ripe, the test weight can go down. And that is a measure of, it's a Winchester bushel, so it's like this big pail, and it's used as a standard measure for how much volume can you fit in that bushel bucket. So for wheat, the US grade number 1 starts at 57 pounds in that bucket. You would really want to have 60 pounds for the top standard test weight for wheat. And so if you harvest wheat that's been rained on a couple times, that changes the protein, it lowers the protein. So you'll have, maybe it's kind of like the wheat is puffed up and then maybe it shrinks. You can actually look at a kernel and see it's kind of puffed a little bit, and that's usually a lower test weight wheat. Just from what I've seen, there can be a lot of variation in looking at things and trying to judge it. So that's why the testing equipment can be important. So that is kind of in a farmer's control. Protein, you can do different farming practices to increase the protein. Nitrogen in the soil is one of the things that can increase protein. And also drought stress, I would say, increases protein levels. When you have a really wet year at the wrong time, it seems to lower the protein. But there are sometimes farmers can predict that it's going to be a low protein, and they may put a foliar fertilizer on at a certain time in the spring, and that may help increase the protein a little bit. And moisture, that mostly has to do with rain at harvest and just allowing the crop to mature in the field or through other means. Drying. Some of the other quality things you can control with setting the combine right, cleaning after you've harvested. You can actually increase the test weight a little bit through cleaning. The lighter material can get blown out of a seed cleaner, and you'll be left with maybe heavier kernels, or sizing. Different sizes of kernels may, as you run them through the machine, you may get the standard size, standard test weight. But maybe some of the smaller kernels would be higher protein. So once again, testing, it can be very important. Sample techniques that some people use as they go into a particular field, they may take a sample as they're cutting, and that's usually when people get the moisture test, the first moisture test, to know, is it the right time to straight cut the wheat? You can take a blended sample of multiple fields afterwards, either by blending yourself from all the samples you collected at harvest, or if you have a joint storage area, you can stick a probe in there, or just take spots from different parts of the storage unit. And I think I'm ready to go into the tests that we've done over the years. So there's a chart that will pull up on the screen, and it's not consistent. We haven't done a complete set of tests all throughout our time growing grains, but we've done basic tests, and you'll see that we have test weight from since 2006, and the protein with different crop rotation and fertilizer mixes affecting the protein. So we've done some fish fertilizer, manure, some alfalfa, like rotating after alfalfa tests on those fields, just fallow with no inputs. All of these we think have different effects on the protein. And some of it just has to do with the year. It's kind of out of your control, but in general, we think that alfalfa has an effect on wheat, where if you rotate into wheat, you will get quite a high protein level. So 12.5 is pretty standard for bread baking. We've seen as high as 16 protein, which I'm hoping that Andy will chime in later to kind of explain the baking, the effect on baking that those different proteins have. This past year we had 10 protein on just across the board, all of our fields, all crop rotations, all fertilizers. It was just kind of a low protein year. So it's really hard to get everything top-notch, US grade #1, but I don't think that should stop people from trying to sell the crop. It's not like you just have to throw it away. Don't throw it in the trash. You can feed it to livestock. You can sell it for seed. You can put it into different types of food markets. And especially I think if you're working with artisan bakers, you can still sell low protein or the different quality traits for food. The main thing is that they don't have vomitoxin. That's a bad thing that people can't really eat. Or there's a few other things that you should maybe test for if it's a problem in your area that would absolutely keep it from being a food grade crop. So, Andy, did you want to talk a little bit about working with different crop years? And
sure. So, you know, we've been using wheat from Bryce and Demetrius Farm for 5 years straight at Moxie, and also before I had used some wheat at Whole Foods from them many years prior. And First and foremost, working with a single farmer, single crop year is a very different thing than going and buying flour from a distributor, from say King Arthur, where King Arthur is blending possibly different crop years and certainly different wheats, maybe 5 or 6 different wheats to arrive at a spec that they've agreed on with their customer. So, Sir Galahad from King Arthur, I think the spec is something like 12.5 protein, 45 ash, 14 moisture, and a falling number that I can't recall. And year over year, they blend to that spec, and it's very consistent. Most of the big mills are pretty consistent, whether it's Ardent or Bay States or King Arthur. And there's not a lot of change, not a ton of changeover at crop, at harvest. And you can, you just sort of do your thing, and your recipe more or less works like it did the day before, the week before, the month before. But when you move over to using, whether it's heirloom or modern variety from one crop year, and certainly from one farmer, you get exactly what this chart shows you visually. So, let's look at the year 2016. And the blended protein sample came out at 13.5 protein, which would be considered a strong bread flour. 12.5 protein is more or less your kind of standard bread flour. So 13.5 as far as a number goes, and numbers don't tell the whole story, and we can talk about that in a minute. But as far as a number goes, 13.5 is pretty solid. You go to the next year, it's 12.1, pretty solid again, kind of in that range. In 2018, jumped up to 15% moisture, which would be considered high gluten by most people. So that'd be great for making, chewy New York style pizza. It would be great for making very well hydrated artisan breads that would probably get really good loaf volume as well, and probably be tolerant to some abuse in the dough mixing process, probably tolerant to overproofing or underproofing. And then you look at 2019 and you've got 10. So, my boys and I were actually at Demetria's farm when they did the first test cut on what looked like a really beautiful field. And, big, beautiful plump berries. And we all drove down to get them tested at their local elevator, and through the machine, and it came out reading like 9.9 or 9.8 protein, and I almost fell over, in sort of fear of, gosh, I don't know if I can bake bread with this, because I'd never baked bread with anything less than maybe 10.8 protein. And even at that, I'd sort of struggled. So, and I'll just stop and say that, a protein number as a percent is just a number, and it's an indicator of quality, but it's not the end all be all. And this story I'm about to tell you illustrates that really well. So, you can have 15% protein grain that doesn't make amazing bread. And in 2019, we had 10% protein grain that's been making some of the best bread we've ever made. So we drove home from Demetria's farm, and we did a little test bake on that grain. And it actually didn't come out very good, but it did come out. And I was surprised that it even was able to form a dough to tolerate a reasonable mixing time, which for us was maybe 10 minutes in total. And it was just a little bit more dense. It didn't absorb as much water in the dough. I think it was about 3% less water. And it turned out being okay, not great, but enough that I called Demetria and I said, hey, I tested it, and oh my gosh, it actually, even at that low protein, it made decent bread. We were planning on maybe blending it with some higher protein. We were thinking to bring in some Corazon kamutz and blend in 10% you know, 10% of our flour in the recipe would have been a 16% protein Corazon from Bob Quinn. And we waited a week or two because I think Demetria and Bryce didn't actually harvest everything at that time. I think they waited another week, and we did another test. Ended up being about a month later, and you know, the dough performed much better. It absorbed more water, it mixed stronger, and it made bread that was very, very good. And I called Demetria and I said, you know, I don't know what is going on here. And it turns out that month of the grain sweating really contributed to a higher quality, you know, flour in the long run. And so we've been using, you know, we're about 80% of the way through last year's crop, right, Demetria? We still have some left, but we're almost through it, and it's been great. And it's actually ironically been our strongest grain that we've used all year. We've used, you know, some Rouge de Bordeaux, some Sonora White, some other grains that are much higher in protein, 13, 14, 15% protein. And the Stevens Land and Cattle 10% protein was the winner this year. So, you know, we've learned that you have to adjust your process as a baker every year when you get a new crop, and the numbers tell you something, but what really tells you what you need to do is just making dough with it and seeing how it feels, how does it proof, you know, different enzyme activity levels, different protein levels, different hydration and absorption levels. So, you know, I look at the numbers, but I really watch what happens when I bake with it. And, you know, the French cereal chemists will tell you that, you know, protein quantity means nothing. It's protein quality. And there are not easy ways to test it in the US unless you have a alveograph, and you can actually run what's called a P over L test, and it tests the extensibility versus the elasticity of the dough. It essentially blows like a giant bubble. You form a little lab sample of dough, you let it relax, and then you put it in a machine that literally blows a bubble, just like bubble gum, with it. And the overall volume of air that little bubble can take, and the duration of time before it pops it's called your W, and the P over L, I believe, is the interaction of resistance and elasticity versus extensibility. But that's how you test quality of wheat. So I bet you, and maybe we should do this, Demetria, if we send some off to a lab, you know, Ardent has an alveograph. Bay States, you know, have an alveograph at their headquarters in Minneapolis, or at their main lab in Minneapolis. I bet you if we sent that off, it would perform really high in that P over L test, and it could be a really fun thing to look at. You know, the difference between protein percent and protein quality.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to know. And another thing that I think it's hard to test for is flavor, and that you really have to just bake the bread and try it. And that's something that we see variation with, and I don't know how to grow for flavor yet, but that's something I'm really interested in.
Well, I think terroir is a really interesting concept. And we swapped through so many different wheats, grain over the course of a month. And we actually had some customer feedback recently on some bread that they, you know, was made with the same wheat variety. It was made with Turkey Red. One from Colorado farmer and one from Kansas from Bryce and Demetria. And to be honest with you, I hadn't actually done a side-by-side taste comparison. They both looked like good wheat. The numbers were decent on the Colorado one, and they were 10% on the Kansas grain. And a customer gave some observation that there was a big flavor difference. So we did a side-by-side comparison, and what we noticed was that the Kansas wheat had this more nutty, sweet, malty, a kind of deeper, broader flavor. And the Colorado one, both crop year 2019, and ironically probably about 2 hours drive time from each other, had less of that kind of malty, sweet nuttiness. It tasted great. It just didn't taste quite as big and bold and broad as the Kansas wheat. And it wasn't until we did a real side-by-side and kind of more scientific evaluation that we were able to notice it. But, it's all those little subtle things when you're baking bread that go into it. Is it sea salt that's unrefined and maybe has some extra trace minerals in there that you're getting some flavor from? Is it the terroir of the wheat? Is it really delicious spring water? Is it a slightly different style of fermentation with your sourdough starter? And, customers clearly, and with this individual in particular, at the end of the day, notice the difference, right? And maybe it's multiple things stacked on top of each other that make that je ne sais quoi of the terroir.
Yeah. And I think there's maybe some questions that relate to this discussion too.
Sure, we can definitely go to that. In fact, we'll start right up with that. And then Andy, I suppose if you want to quit sharing your screen, unless we want to go back to reference this. But yeah, as far as some of those questions around terroir and flavor and everything, Eleanor was asking, Andy, what do you mean when you say winter? Talking about that wheat. The question is, did you use it in most bread types, in your most popular bread, or just how it bakes? So leaving it a month to sweet or to sweat increased protein quality is the question, or just increased extensibility, or could you elaborate any more on just kind of what all you meant by all of that?
As far as the wheat improving over the course of a month?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the basic question. And then just kind of how did you, as far as calling it a winner, like what did you find as far as just the value of that? Was it that it was a variety of bread that sold more than others, or just that you appreciated the way it baked? Or
yeah, so what we look for in an ideal world is that we are able to get wheat that we can grind and make into a dough that holds a relatively high amount of water, compared to a different grain that we're using. So, when you switch between spelt and einkorn and a hard red winter wheat, your absorption is drastically different, right? Spelt absorbs maybe 25% less moisture. And, water is free, so relatively. So, from a baking perspective, water is an ingredient you want to use liberally. And then the more hydration that you can get into a dough, the better the moisture will be, of course, and the more open the pore structure will be. So one of the things we're always trying to achieve baking artisan bread is just pumping that, moisture up as much as the wheat can tolerate. And so that sweating period, which I'd heard of it, and I think, Dimitri, we've never actually cut one day and baked the next day. I think there's always a lag time in your processing, in our, using the previous crop year up. We've never been that quick, from field to loaf. So maybe that was just an error on my part and kind of threw us off a little bit. But back to the quality of the dough, holds a lot of water, It was much stronger, so it was easier to mix it to a full development without it starting to break down. And when we can mix a dough and develop the gluten more, it then will be a higher loaf volume in the oven. A better loaf volume means it's not quite as dense, and it's generally ends up being a more attractive loaf, because when you score it and you cut the top, it pops nice and it looks the way, it's visually appealing. I can't say that we sold more or less of that 2019 crop turkey red from Kansas. And, the one customer that noticed is also a very, very detailed guy who, my other conversation with that gentleman this month was about, coffee beans and which side of the, 3,000 meter yardstick the coffee was grown on, and was it shady, and was it sunny that afternoon it was harvest. I mean, this guy is just, incredibly, has a great palate, and he's really paying attention. We find that we're rotating through so many different grains and stuff that our customers often don't know. We often don't even communicate clearly that, hey, today we're using, Demetria Stevens Kansas Turkey Red from 2019. We're actually working to improve that. But so it was more about us and our processing that we really liked being, having that extra strength in the dough relative to what we thought it was going to be at the test harvest.
All right. And then, just staying on the conversation around protein, Anthony was asking, how does the variation in protein levels affect your standing in the marketplace? And then I'm just also curious too of you mentioned animal feed, but how you market, maybe a product that you can't necessarily sell for bread.
So the protein levels, because people use the US grading system for protein, some buyers will just get turned off completely if you're out of line with the protein level specs that they're used to. Some will accept a sample and actually do the test to see what they see, and I would encourage that. But in general, it's been very difficult for grain farmers who are trying to get into food grade bread markets in my region. In the last year, most of the wheat has been going to feed markets just because of the protein level. If the test weight is very low also, and the protein level is very high, some people have had a really hard time getting into the food markets there too, or even feed markets, just because it's been so out of line. But if the germination was very high on that same crop, maybe they could get into a seed market. That's the kind of flexibility I think farmers should be thinking more about. And it has a lot to do with just connecting with the buyers to know what they want, and the buyers having some openness to trying different things, trying a sample before they just outright reject it just because of the number. And then there was a second part of that question, I think.
I think just kind of getting to how you market with animal feeds, if it just goes to the local elevator, or if there's any other options for you.
So animal markets, I think there's a lot of with the organic markets, there's a lot more poultry operations that are coming online organic. There's a lot of dairies, but they don't really want wheat so much. They maybe want some other types. And with the poultry operations also, they want maybe soybeans or corn or some of the other things. You can't really force your way into those markets, but it is good that the animals have a diverse diet. If you do any seed cleaning, the screenings are probably going to go for feed. So you can do seed cleaning to increase the test weight and increase the quality for food, And you can also sell those screenings as feed. So maybe connecting with some local, as we're maybe going to get more local food, local chicken and beef producers, just kind of connecting with those I would encourage people to grow with those kinds of smaller operations to give people more of a whole diet locally. And I think someone had a question on soil amendments. We don't purchase any amendments at all. But I guess sometimes we purchase seed. But one year we purchased fish fertilizer, but all of our fertility amendments come from within our farm.
Okay, and then yeah, I guess I'm just curious too about your alfalfa. Do you guys contract any of that, or how do you market your fields when they're in their alfalfa rotation?
So we aren't. We have dryland alfalfa, and it doesn't produce a lot. It doesn't produce maybe high quality. We don't have the equipment to sell large amounts of alfalfa to some of the buyers. You usually have to have large square bales of a certain quality to sell alfalfa. So we use it for our own livestock, and we just kind of, that's one of our fertility programs, is having livestock, alfalfa. Yes.
Well, and I don't know if we got into that much, but do you want to elaborate any more on your livestock side of things? Just
Sure. Yes. I think livestock are very integral to a grain farm. I think you really shouldn't have just a grain farm. You should have livestock with your grain farm because of the you can feed them leftover or stuff that people can't eat, and then the animals provide fertility for your grain crops. So it's a part of just symbiosis. And we don't really do a lot of marketing with our livestock products, the meat or eggs that come from our animals, but it's really just that's our own challenge that we have to deal with, being really far away from markets with a kind of a perishable product.
Sure. And then looks like one other question we have in right now. Anthony was asking if you've ever rotated in other grains or just kind of stick to turkey bread.
We have tried a lot of different grains over the years. In this year, we're planting maybe more than we have for many years. So I'm raising a little bit of oats. We're doing some corn, grain sorghum, forage sorghum, and white wheat, hard white winter wheat. So a pretty diverse lineup this year.
We're trying some buckwheat, maybe. Got the
Maybe,
I've planted sesame in the past. It was a crop failure. Wrong region to grow sesame seeds. I've tried cotton, not a grain crop, but I have probably about 50 different seed types that I've tried to grow on this farm just to see if it would work. It's usually out of out of compliance as far as what's grown in the region. And I just tried it for an experiment, and most of it was a failure, just for the fun of it. So we've grown a lot of different, anything I could get my hands on, I would put it in the ground and see what happened. Just, that's all I know.
Great. Well, thank you, Bryce. And one other question came in from Liza as far as what animals do you raise as part of your soil fertility program?
One of the main animals that I came to originally was bison, because it was the bison that fertilized the Great Plains. You could say it wasn't Angus and Holstein cows running around giving droppings to make the soil fertile. It was the bison and other wild animals like elk and deer and bear and wolf, but mostly the bison. So I had a herd of bison that I got it started on, and they're really not for market. They're just our soil enhancers. And we raise cattle too. We used to be dairy here. We milk 30 cows twice a day. And from the dairy herd, it was Holstein. When we stopped dairying, we went to beef cattle production and with Hereford and Angus crosses. And we still have those cattle. That comes from the 1950s. So we have beef, about 80 head. And we have had pigs here. We raised pigs quite a bit there for a while. So we got out of that. And then poultry. We have chickens. We have ducks right now. We did have geese and turkeys, but we kind of trimmed that operation. And it's mostly for our own use, small amount of direct sales. And we use the turkey, the poultry, it's a hot manure, so it's blended into our fertilizer piles that where we generate fertility for the fields. We just pour it all together from the feeding areas where we do feed the bison and the cattle in the wintertime, push those into piles, stick some chicken manure in it, put some biodynamic preps, that's just herbs, to build certain kinds of bacteria enhancement, and then put that on the field. And it goes on the field, it looks like dirt. It's humus, it's black humus. And I have tried to experiment with making humic acid. So humic acid and fulvic acid. It's something that's ongoing, and that's why when Demetrius said it comes from our farm, well, it does. I experiment with certain, I guess you call them chemistries, even though I'm an organic farmer.
Great. Well, thank you for that explanation. Yeah, and I certainly see, and I think that even big government organizations such as NRCS are starting to understand the immense value of integrating livestock into farm plans. So it certainly makes sense, and it's exciting to see that you've been doing it for so long. And also, I don't think I've ever heard of anyone just saying that they keep bison for their fertilizer program, which is pretty amazing to me.
Bryce, where did you get the buffalo droppings before you had a herd?
Before I went to the sale in Salina. I was a member of the Kansas Bison Association, and I bought 2 bulls that were going to be sent back home because they were starving to death out of Oklahoma. I stuck my hand up in the air and they sold those to me for $200 for both of them. I brought them home and they just needed some food. And so then I had 2 bulls and I needed 2 females. So I found a local guy that raised buffalo and he sold me 4 females. That's how I got started. So before that, there was a big buffalo herd between Oakley, Kansas, and Scott City along the Smoky Hill River. And myself and my children and my wife, we used to go down there and sneak across the fence and pick up buffalo food to bring it home to make little bits of fertilizer and spread it on the field. We tried to stretch it, but I figured, well, why don't I just get some buffalo and we could have giant piles of it and then really go to put some fertilizer on the field. We had plenty of cow manure and chicken manure, but I thought there's something different about bison manure, and no scientist has ever been able to tell me if the guts of a bison, it's like a cow, it's 4 stomachs, if there's some kind of different bacteria in that wild animal as compared to domestic animal. I think there is, and that's just my opinion. that's why I collect bison manure specifically for the, I call it a soil inoculant that we put on the field. We can do it with spray or injection into the field.
So talking about flavor a little bit ago, I have kind of a hunch that it has to do with our fertility program. And a couple of years ago, people were noticing like a cinnamon or apple pie flavor or aroma. And I kind of had the hunch that it came from clover rotation. It was a very good year for clover that year. And it seems kind of like that got infused in the wheat somehow. So something else I think about is the storage facilities that we have. Maybe there's something to having different types of storage can maybe infuse something into the grain, like wood. Maybe that would have some kind of effect, like a aging whiskey or something. Maybe it has an effect on the flavor. I don't know. That's something I wish someone would study too. Just where does flavor come from?
You mean like a red cedar? We have red cedar trees around our evergreen. If we cut chunks into it in the grain bin, or maybe if we did aromatherapy in the bin before we stored it.
Well, the cedar does also repel moths, so it might have a double feature, double use.
I think there's a hipster out there somewhere that would pay a lot for some barrel-aged turkey red. So we'll have to check on that. Circle back.
And that's another outlet for maybe stuff that doesn't fit the bread quality. Distillers and brewers. So from what I understand, they want lower protein wheat. And I've been trying to reach those kinds of people, but there's a gap in the infrastructure there aren't enough maltsters between us and the breweries to be able to handle that stage of the process.
That and also different applications, within a bakery. If you can connect directly to whether it's a brewer or a distiller or a baker or a food maker, from the bakery perspective, we want a strong wheat for bread, but not for muffins and scones. So we could buy a certain percentage of lower protein wheat and use it happily in our scones and muffins, and if you had a bakery that was the right size, maybe that was, wholesale production pastry shop, they could buy a ton of, lower protein wheat and be very happy for it. I think you just got to be creative and probably get out front before you go plant a whole ton of wheat. Figure out all of your value added, kind of avenues to take, dependent on what Mother Nature provides that year.
Yes, and if you had variations in the field, like one field coming off the alfalfa is doing 16, and the old fallow field over there is only doing 9, if you segregate them in different bins, then you can market to different users. So it would require, getting bins set up and doing testing right away in the field as you cut to be able to put it in the right storage area. Otherwise, you just blend it, and then you get maybe a little less protein. If you blend a 9 and a 16, you'll get somewhere in between, depending on your volume. So.
And Heartland Mill down south of you guys, I guess, in Marienthal, Kansas, they've been supporting various things, including turkey red for a while. They make a white flour from turkey red. And initially, I guess 4 or 5 years ago, it was single crop, single farmer. And we've discovered and kind of worked with them through the process of blending. So they now are bringing in turkey red from 3 different farmers. I think 2 of them in Kansas. and then also reserving some previous crop year really high protein, high baking performance, and more expensive wheat, and chipping that into their blend so that they can try to achieve a consistent, King Arthur type spec year over year. And I do think that's the way this market will progress as more bigger, mills get on board. They're going to want to blend, and that will be great for the end user too.
And we got one final question. It's a little bit of an origin story question here from Eleanor. I was just curious of how you first connected with Demetria and Bryce.
Oh, it's a great story. I was purchasing a lot of gently used treasures from a architectural salvage in Boulder called Resource before we opened up Moxie 5 years ago, and I was buying refrigerators and radiators and wood and kind of anything we could to reuse that stuff and to keep our costs down. And I was loading up this old refrigerator one day into my truck, and the manager, Brandon, said, hey, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing to all this crap? And I said, well, I'm building a little bakery. And he said, really? That's funny, because my girlfriend, Demetria Stevens, grows a really special kind of wheat, and maybe you'd be up for trying it. And I said, well, what does she grow? And he said, Turkey Red. And I about, fell off my chair because a mutual friend of ours, Tom Leonard in Lawrence, Kansas, had been supporting Turkey Red since the 70s as well. And I had actually used some of Demetria and Bryce's crop at least 10 years prior through Whole Foods Market with Tom Leonard kind of helping to broker the deal. And so I got the wheat sample, I baked with it, it was delicious. And so that's how we start our relationship. And Brandon lives here in Boulder and goes out every weekend or two to help on the farm and see Demetria. And he texts me and says, how many bags of wheat you want? And I say, fill up your truck. And, a couple of days later, we get a delivery. So that's how we met.
Oh, that's great. Demetria, Bryce, you want to add anything to round out the day, or?
I would just say that, just document what you see and try and learn from it. That's really the basics of quality testing. You can use the standards that are out there, and but really document what you see, learn from it, and talk to other people who you want to market to, or just who you want to share crops with, just from a grower's perspective.
Great.
I might add, I've known Tom Leonard for quite a few years, probably over 2 decades, because I was helping another organic grower move some of his white wheat to Tom Leonard, who had a bakery in Salina, Kansas. It wasn't doing very well. It was in the wrong location. He moved to Lawrence, Kansas, set up a bakery, and then he sold that. But he's a guy that makes good bread, and he and I talked about things. He's not the one who got me started on the Turkey Red, but on baking. And I've been at conferences where he has been. He's been real supportive of the heirloom Turkey Red, even to the point of, I think he's the one who instigated getting Turkey Red listed as on the Slow Food Arc of Taste. And he came out to our farm and did a drive-by and a walk in the field years ago. So I've known Tom, and he's written some books. Like, look him up on the internet. He's a good bread baker. I think he was involved in the Bread Baking Guild, which Andy's a part of too, or has been, or is currently. I don't know. Are you still, Andy?
Yep, I am. Yep, as is Tom.
Oh, he's still in there? Okay, good. Yeah, there's a lot of connections that goes way back. People made these connections and try to hang on to these old varieties. And I would say for anybody who's got an old variety in their family, like a Scout 66 or Wichita wheat or Cheyenne wheat, or I can name a whole bunch of them that if you got that, make something out of it. There might be something unique there. Turkey Red's not the only heirloom out there.
Well, that's great. And just wanted to thank you all for such a informative but lovely hour. And really love the part of the conversation of just, really, that question of where does flavor come from? I think that just drives home the fact of the only way you can really know that is to know your farmer. And we're certainly understanding that in these days as well, of just that value of understanding, knowing your farmer and understanding your food chain. And I think that's the overall value of the Colorado grain chain in so many ways is being able to support local farmers, having knowing what you're eating, but then also supporting that entire supply chain. Even just mentioning today about how, there's a lack of malters right now for a region that is so prolific in alcohol production. It seems as a travesty when we grow so many great grains and then we produce so many different kinds of beer and liquors that something like that is missing. So certainly a lot of value to something like the Colorado grain chain. And I think with that, we'll call it a day until the next time. But once again, you can find these videos on YouTube just by searching Colorado Grain Chain. And then you can also access it on coloradograinchain.com. You're welcome to sign up as a member there and access all of these documents and recipes and all the other great resources that are there on the site. So
and
thank you.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in and make us late real quick? I just want to say that I've had the good fortune of working with great farmers and buying very high quantities of grain and other stuff in working with Whole Foods Market for 15 years. But my first visit 5 years ago to Dimitri and Bryce's farm, I took two of my three sons out there. We did a 5-hour road trip, and it was transformational to get to spend an afternoon with these guys and learn to meet their family and learn and to go out in the field with their bison and to understand and see, gosh, how much work they put into it and how good their food tasted. And my kids jump at the opportunity to hop in my truck and drive 5 dusty hours out to Jennings to see these guys. And we do it once or twice a year. And it kind of was, it was a life-changing thing for me to go from being in a very large corporate environment that was buying great food from great people to be in a local system where, we get to see Demetria and Bryce and Brandon on a regular basis and interact with them and know what's going on in their world and be a part of the family. And I'm sure many, many folks out there have that same feeling. And I hope that all of the challenges that are coming with this pandemic will also bring some blessings in that I think folks want to be supportive of their local farmer and to know that their money is going into their local and regional economy. And the benefit of that will be these relationships that are formed, and they're beautiful. So thanks.
More. All right. Well, we'll see you all next week on the Colorado Grain Chain's Homeschool. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye, guys.